My name is Emily, and the events I'm about to share with you happened just a few years ago, when I found myself sitting in the sterile, cold room of a funeral home, preparing for a woman I barely knew to be laid to rest. The woman in question was my mother, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. We had a complicated relationship, one filled with anger, silence, and the occasional attempt at reconciliation that always seemed to fall apart. To say I was conflicted about her death would be an understatement. There were moments when I felt a sense of relief, and then there were moments when grief would unexpectedly hit me, making me question everything I thought I knew about her. She was always a difficult woman, harsh, demanding, and emotionally distant. She had never physically hurt me, but her words, those felt like the sharpest of knives, cutting deep, leaving scars that never quite healed. Over the years, she became more and more absorbed in a strange, almost eerie group of people who practiced all sorts of rituals and followed cryptic philosophies. Her house, once a place of comfort, transformed into something unsettling, a place where shadows seemed to move on their own, and odd noises became the norm. Eventually, my sister and I couldn't bear it anymore, and we moved away, leaving her behind in that strange, dark atmosphere she had cultivated. When I got the call, it was from my sister. "She's gone," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do, Em. I told her I'd be there as soon as I could." We met at the funeral home to make the arrangements. The funeral director informed us that Mom had been found on the couch in her living room, dead for 2 days before anyone discovered her. The cause of death was a heart attack, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed at the funeral home alone for hours that evening, filling out paperwork while my sister left to care for her newborn. As the night wore on, the quiet began to feel suffocating. The building, old and creaky, seemed to come alive with strange sounds, each creak of the floorboards sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to push away the uneasy feeling that was creeping over me, but then I heard it. A voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. It called my name. Emily. I froze, my heart racing. It was my mother's voice, or at least it sounded like hers. Slowly I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked toward the hallway from where the voice seemed to come. The long corridor stretched before me, lined with doors, some open, revealing empty rooms with caskets and medical equipment. At the very end of the hallway, there was a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," and that was where the voice seemed to be coming from. I wasn't sure why I did it, but I gathered what little courage I had left and opened the door. Inside, it was cold, unnaturally cold, with a dim light hanging overhead. The room was dominated by a large metal table draped in white linen. I stepped forward, my flashlight illuminating the room as I moved closer. The table was empty, at least it seemed to be. Then I saw it, my mother's body, lying motionless on the table. The sight of her, still and lifeless, made my stomach twist. But as I took another step forward, something strange happened. Her fingers twitched. My heart skipped a beat, and I could feel my blood run cold. My rational mind told me it was just muscle spasms, post-mortem reflexes. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole story. Then, without warning, her eyes snapped open. Those cold, lifeless eyes stared directly at me, unblinking, unfeeling. I stumbled back, my hand shaking, the beam of my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to steady it. My breath caught in my throat as her mouth moved. No sound came out, but it was clear she was trying to speak, trying to say something. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and fled the room, not stopping until I was back in the reception area, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just finished the paperwork as quickly as I could, barely able to keep my hands steady, and left for the night. The next morning at the funeral, I tried to focus on being there for my family. My husband and kids stuck close by, offering comfort. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The weight in my chest, the unease, lingered like a dark cloud overhead. During the service, something else happened. My youngest, Lily, who was only 6 years old, stood by the casket, talking softly to herself. I walked over to her, concern growing in my chest. "Lily, honey, who are you talking to?" I asked. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and innocent. "Grandma," she said. "She told me she's sorry." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Lily nodded, her expression serious. "She said she didn't mean to hurt you or Aunt Rachel. She's sorry for everything." Tears welled up in my eyes as I knelt down to her level, my chest tightening with a mix of emotions. My mother had never apologized to me in life, not once. Yet here was my daughter carrying that message. A strange feeling washed over me, part peace, part discomfort. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but it felt significant, like a bridge between two worlds. I placed my hand over Lily's, pressing my fingers gently against hers. "I forgive her," I whispered, not sure if I was saying it for my mother or for myself. In that moment, I wanted to believe that somehow she had found the closure she needed. From that day on, the oppressive heaviness that had hung over me since my mother's passing began to lift, bit by bit. Maybe, just maybe, she had finally found peace, and I think I did too. It was just after dark when I found myself walking down the empty, echoing hallways of the university's medical building. My name is Andrea, and this was during my second year at the university. I was studying psychology, but the med school atmosphere, full of labs and skeletal models, always had me on edge. The building had an old historical charm, and the faint smell of formaldehyde lingered in the air, reminding us all that this was where life and death met. I had been on campus late that night with my friend Lisa, working on a project for one of our professors. He was a bit of an odd one, always buried in his own work, and tonight he was in the anatomy lab. After searching for him throughout the building, a lab assistant mentioned that he was probably busy with some recent deliveries. We didn't think much of it at the time. I wasn't a stranger to the anatomy lab. It was a cold, sterile room, and no one ever spent more time there than necessary. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting brief shadows that made everything seem slightly more unsettling than usual. We entered the lab, which was just as I remembered. Stainless steel tables and glass cabinets filled with body parts, lifeless remains of once living people. It was the kind of place that felt too quiet, too still, and I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl up my spine as I made my way further in. Lisa, ever the curious one, immediately went off to look for our professor, leaving me alone to wait. The silence stretched on, broken only by the hum of the lights and the soft scrape of shoes on the cold tile floor. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A faint glow coming from one of the refrigeration units at the far end of the room. These units were meant to preserve body parts, organs, and sometimes even full cadavers. I didn't think much of it at first. The unit had a small window, and through it I could see a dim light. Maybe it was just an old, malfunctioning bulb, but something made me look again. I saw it. Movement. A shadow, quick and fleeting, disappearing just as fast as I noticed it. I told myself it was my imagination, just the way the light was reflecting. But then it happened again. And again. The shadows grew bolder, moving inside the cold unit. Not just one shadow, but several. They crossed paths, moving in directions that didn't make sense. I felt my pulse quicken as I stared at the frosted glass. It couldn't be. I wanted to believe it was my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I felt something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the door to the unit rattled. It started soft, like someone was tapping on the door from inside. But then it grew more violent, as if someone, was trapped, desperately trying to break free. I jumped from my seat and rushed to the door, grabbing the handle with trembling hands. It was locked just as it should be, but something about it felt wrong. My heart raced as panic set in. I wasn't going to open the door myself, but I needed help. I found the campus security guard, explained what was happening, and though he seemed skeptical, he agreed to come with me. When we returned to the lab, I was relieved to see my professor and Lisa talking casually in the corner. They seemed completely unaware of the strange noises I had heard. I insisted the guard check the refrigeration unit. He unlocked it, and together we peered inside. The unit was empty, nothing but 3 hanging body parts swaying gently, as if they had just been disturbed. No shadows, no strange movements, nothing. I felt a cold wave of confusion wash over me. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain what I had seen, but the professor cut me off, his voice tight with forced cheer. "It's nothing. Just a malfunction, probably. Don't worry about it." He ushered us out of the lab, his smile strained. Months went by, and eventually the professor stopped teaching my classes. The strange encounter had haunted me, and I knew I had to ask him about it, just to get some closure. When I finally did, he seemed uncomfortable, almost nervous. He didn't make eye contact as he spoke. "That lab," he began, his voice low, "has a long history of strange things happening. Shadows that shouldn't be there. Whispers. Even soft cries sometimes late at night. Staff and students who stay after hours, well, they know the rule. No one should be in there past 10 p.m. It's believed that the spirits of the preserved bodies haunt that room, drawn to them. It's not something we talk about much, but we know. It's been happening for years." I didn't know what to say to that. I could feel a shiver run down my spine. It was as if everything I had witnessed that night had a twisted explanation, one that made a horrifying kind of sense. The restless spirits, the shadows. I had never believed in ghosts before, but standing in that lab, seeing the way the cadavers seemed to move, I wasn't so sure anymore. After that, I made a vow never to linger around that building at night. I still attend classes, still learn what I can, but the old anatomy lab, I steer clear of it. Some things are better left unexplored, especially when it feels like the past still lingers, waiting to remind you of its presence. My name's Louis, and the story I'm about to tell you is one I've kept to myself for a long time. I used to work at a morgue in a small town in the Midwest. It wasn't a big place, just a few rooms, and a few cold, sterile floors. I'd been there for a couple of years before I started hearing the whispers. At first, I didn't believe the stories that floated around the break room or the hallways, but looking back, I wish I had paid more attention. There was this tale about a former coroner, a man everyone knew as a gentle, polite figure, a guy who made everyone feel at ease. He was the kind of person who could easily win over a room with his quiet demeanor and charm. Nobody had any reason to suspect anything was wrong until the rumors started. People said that when the night shift fell and everyone had gone home, he did things that no one could even imagine. Things so vile that even the other staff were too horrified to speak of them openly. Apparently, he desecrated the bodies. No one knew why, but it went on for years. Then, one night, someone discovered what he'd been doing. His actions were so dark that the town couldn't ignore them anymore. The coroner was fired immediately, and the whole place was in an uproar. But that wasn't the end of it. Word spread that the coroner couldn't let go of his twisted obsession. People said he came back, sneaking into the morgue under cover of darkness. The rumors were absurd, but the staff couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the night that sealed the legend. They found his body in the morgue, in one of the cold storage rooms, twisted and broken beyond recognition. His limbs were bent and mangled, like they'd been crushed by some unseen force. The sound of his bones snapping as they moved his body still echoes in my mind. After that, they shut the morgue down for a while, and when it reopened, the atmosphere had changed. The other workers, the ones who'd been there before, whispered about the coroner's ghost. They told us new hires to avoid the storage rooms at night and to keep a flashlight close by. At first, I thought they were just making things up to scare the rookies, but after a few months on the job, I learned that the warnings weren't just superstition. One stormy night, I was the only one working late. The rain was pounding against the windows and lightning lit up the hallways. Everything was still when the power suddenly cut out. The emergency lights didn't kick in right away, and the whole place plunged into darkness. I called for the security guard, but there was no answer. It felt like I was all alone in that cold, empty building. I tried to stay calm, thinking it was just a temporary outage. But then I heard something. At first, it was just a faint crackling, like the sound of something fragile being crushed. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, like bones snapping or grinding together. The sound grew louder, and it seemed to be moving toward me. Panic started creeping in, but I forced myself to move. I remembered where the supply room was, where the flashlights were kept, and made my way down the hallway. As I walked, the crackling sound followed me, louder with every step. It was like something or someone was dragging itself along the floor, the sound so rhythmic it felt deliberate. I reached the supply room and fumbled in the dark, my hands trembling as I grabbed the flashlight. When I turned it on and looked back, the sound stopped. Just like that. Nothing. I shined the light down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My heart was racing, and I could feel the weight of being watched pressing down on me. I told myself I was just imagining things. I returned to my desk and tried to focus on the paperwork, but the eerie sensation wouldn't leave. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. The next morning, when the light was back, I found something that made my blood run cold. By the storage room door there were muddy footprints, deep, claw-like scratches gouged into the wall, as if something or someone had scraped its way down the hallway, dragging itself toward me during the blackout. Suddenly, the stories about the coroner made sense. For the first time, I understood the warnings my colleagues had given me. After that night, I never worked a late shift again without keeping every light in the building on, and I never went near that storage room alone. The fear of what might be waiting there in the dark stayed with me long after I left the morgue. It was a place haunted not just by ghosts, but by the terrible things people are capable of when no one is watching. My name's Alex, and I've been working as a night cleaner at a funeral home for the past couple of months. I didn't think it would be too hard, but after a while I found the whole place unsettling. Mostly the heavy air of grief that seemed to hang around like a cloud. Every evening I'd walk through the dark hallways, wiping down counters, vacuuming the floors, trying my best not to think about the fact that just a few rooms over, bodies were being prepared for viewings. It wasn't exactly a place for a good night's sleep. One evening, late in October, we received the body of a little girl, only 5 years old. She had died from a sudden illness, and the whole situation broke my heart. I've got a little girl at home myself, and the thought of losing her, it was unbearable. The staff had me and another cleaner, Maria, bring the small white casket into the preparation room. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. It was so small, and the weight of it hit me hard. I tried to focus on the job and push the sadness aside. The thing is, in a place like that, you can't really afford to get too attached to any one thing, not if you want to stay sane. As the hours dragged on, the staff slowly trickled out, leaving just me and the embalmer, Linda, who was working on preparing the child's body for the viewing the next day. By the time midnight rolled around, I was alone in the building, cleaning the restrooms. I was cleaning up the bathroom, trying not to think too much about the dark shadows creeping around the place when I heard footsteps, soft ones coming down the hallway. I thought it was probably Linda, so I called out, "Hey, I'm just cleaning in here." There was no answer, which was odd. I bent down and looked under the stall doors, and that's when I saw them. A pair of tiny feet, shiny black shoes and little white socks just standing there. My heart skipped a beat. I figured it must be someone's kid who wandered in. It wasn't uncommon for families to visit the funeral home with their children in tow, so I stepped out of the bathroom to check. But when I walked through the hall, I found it empty. No one was around, except for Linda in the preparation room. I told Linda about what I saw, half expecting her to laugh it off. But when I described the shoes, her face went white. She insisted we go check it out together, so we did. When we got to the bathroom, there was nothing there. No shoes, no tiny feet, just the echo of the silence. Linda seemed disturbed, but she brushed it off and went back to her work, telling me to let her know if anything else happened. I tried to forget about it, thinking maybe it was just exhaustion messing with me. I returned to cleaning, but as I was wiping down the counters, I heard it, the faint sound of crying. It was soft at first, just a whisper of sound, but it wasn't a sound you could ignore. It came from the preparation room where the little girl's body was. My heart raced as I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. When I reached the door, I peeked inside. The room was empty. Linda had already gone home for the night. The small casket, still sealed tight, sat there alone in the dim light. The crying stopped as I stepped inside, and the air felt heavy, thick with an unspoken weight. I was suddenly aware of how alone I was. I hesitated, my hand shaking as I reached out and placed it gently on the casket. I whispered a small prayer just for the child, hoping somehow it would help her find peace. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, soft, high-pitched and unmistakable, a little giggle. I froze. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my eyes darting to the casket, but nothing had changed. The room was empty. I didn't know what I was hearing or why, but I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my things, locked up, and practically ran to my car, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't make sense of. The next morning, I came in early, still shaken, to prepare for the family's viewing. I stood back and watched as they gathered around the casket, their faces full of grief. The little girl's mother was barely holding herself together, whispering over and over through her sobs. She hated the dark. She was always so afraid of being alone at night. Her words struck me deep. That's when it all clicked. The crying, the giggle, the tiny shoes. The little girl hadn't wanted to be left alone. She was just a child after all. And now she was alone in the dark, a place she feared more than anything. A wave of guilt and sadness washed over me. I had always tried to block out the weight of the job, but now I understood something about that night, something I couldn't shake. I told my wife everything that evening. She could tell it was starting to take a toll on me. I'd never really realized how hard it would be, but after that night, I knew it was time to go. A week later, I quit, but even now the memory of that child, the small shoes, the giggle and the soft cries, lingers with me. It's the kind of thing you don't forget, no matter how hard you try. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear that faint laugh, echoing in the quiet of the dark. It was a cold, quiet evening when it all happened. I'm Noah, and for a while I worked the night shift at a small mortuary on the outskirts of a quiet town. The hours were long, the work lonely, and sometimes the silence almost unbearable. But in a way, I had gotten used to it. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. I prepped bodies for viewings, arranged flowers, and helped with the logistics for funerals. It wasn't a job most people could handle, but I found peace in the order it required. That is, until one particular Friday evening. I was alone that night, a rare occurrence. The owner, Mr. Connolly, had left to take care of some paperwork for a funeral that was scheduled the next morning. He trusted me to handle the last body of the day, a man named Arthur, who'd been tragically killed in a car crash. His family had arranged for a simple service, and the body needed to be prepped before the viewing. When the transport truck arrived, I went to the back to assist with bringing in the coffin. It wasn't anything elaborate, just a plain wooden box. The transport workers handed it to me without much ceremony, and together we placed it gently on the preparation table in the main room. But then something caught my attention. The coffin had a lock, a heavy brass padlock that secured it shut. I frowned, thinking it was an unusual request from the family. Maybe it was for security, or maybe there was a reason for the added precaution. I asked the workers if they had a key, but they didn't. The driver seemed as confused as I was. They said it had arrived like this, no instructions, just locked up tight. My curiosity, though, was stronger than my better judgment. I gave Mr. Connolly a quick call to get his take on it. His voice crackled through the phone, thick with confusion. A locked coffin? That's strange, he said. He told me to wait until morning to figure it out. Don't tamper with it, Noah. We'll sort it out when I get back. but I couldn't let it go. The idea of a locked coffin tugged at me, and I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see for myself. I glanced around the room and spotted a pair of large shears used for trimming floral arrangements. They weren't the perfect tool, but they'd have to do. With my heart thumping in my chest, I approached the lock and set to work. The metal squealed as I forced it open, and when it finally snapped, I hesitated. The moment felt like it lasted forever. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Empty. I blinked, stunned. For a split second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I leaned in closer, peering into the coffin's interior, but there was no mistake. It was empty. My stomach dropped. Had they made a mistake? Or was there something else going on? I wasn't given time to think it over. A soft knock came from behind me. I spun around, my pulse racing, but no one was there. The preparation room door, which I had sworn I'd closed, creaked open on its own. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it slowly swing wider. Then from the shadows, a figure stepped into the room. I froze. It was him, Arthur. But it wasn't just any ordinary man. His skin had a ghostly pallor, almost translucent, and his eyes shimmered with an eerie glow, unnatural and cold. He wore the same suit his family had chosen for his burial, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, his lips barely curling into a faint, knowing smile. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air growing thick with dread. Without a word, Arthur raised a hand and pointed to the coffin behind me. His voice, low and distant, echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have opened it." Before I could respond, before I could even take a step back, he turned and melted into the shadows. Gone. The room was silent again. My body trembled with fear. The lights above buzzed softly as I stood frozen in place, my mind reeling. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Panic flooded me, and I hurried to shut the coffin lid, slamming it closed with shaking hands. I didn't bother to try and lock it back up. There was no time. I grabbed my things, rushed out of the room, and fled the building. I didn't turn back. The next morning I called Mr. Connolly, my voice barely audible as I told him what happened. I could barely explain what I'd seen, but the truth was clear in my mind. I couldn't go back to that mortuary. The job had been too much for me, and whatever I'd witnessed the night before, I wasn't prepared to face it again. I resigned that same day. I couldn't bring myself to even step foot in that building one last time. Arthur's ghostly figure haunted me. The look in his eyes burned into my memory, and I still hear his words sometimes, as if they're whispered in my ear. "You shouldn't have opened it." And to this day, I can't say for sure what happened that night. I don't know if it was the exhaustion, the pressure of the job, or something far more sinister at play. But there's one thing I know for certain. Some things are best left undisturbed, no matter how tempting they may seem. Some doors should never be opened. My name's Alex, and I've been working as a mortician for a couple of years now. But there's one night that still shakes me to the core, and it's a memory I'll never shake. It was a rainy, cold evening. One of those nights where the world seems to hold its breath, and everything feels just a little off. I was alone in the funeral home, stuck on the late shift. The steady sound of rain against the windows kept me company, and the wind howled, rattling the old wooden frame of the building. Around midnight, my phone buzzed, and I answered. The voice on the other end was strained, almost fragile. An elderly man, shaking with grief, told me his wife had just passed away at home. He asked if I could help transport her body to the funeral home. I didn't hesitate. It was a strange request, but it wasn't unusual for people to pass at home, so I gathered my things and drove out to the address he provided. The house was an old, Victorian-style mansion tucked at the end of a narrow street. The faint glow of a porch light cast long shadows across the front yard. The man met me at the door, looking every bit like someone who'd lived through 100 storms. His face was drawn with sadness, and his hands trembled as he led me upstairs to where his wife had passed. The bedroom was exactly how you'd imagine an old, forgotten space. Dusty furniture, heavy curtains that blocked out what little light there was. And there she was, lying in a large bed, her body delicate and pale. She was dressed in a white gown, a veil covering her face, as though she was some ghostly vision. Her frailty was striking, almost unreal. As I prepared to move her, I noticed faint needle marks on her arms, a sign of the medication she must have been on in her final days. I couldn't help but ask, "Did you contact a doctor for the death certificate?" "I'm a doctor," the man said quietly, his voice steady, but filled with an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. "There's no need for anyone else. She's at peace now." Something about his tone struck me as odd, but I didn't press further. I loaded her into the body bag and began the walk back to the van. The man insisted on coming with me, which was unusual. Usually families prefer to stay home during these transports, but he was determined to accompany her, and who was I to argue? The drive to the funeral home felt heavier than it should have. The rain pounded on the van's roof as I drove through the wet streets, and the silence between us was almost suffocating. The man sat beside me, but his mind seemed miles away. He started talking. At first about how much he loved his wife, how they had been together for over 40 years. But then something shifted in his voice. His memories turned darker, more somber. He spoke of her depression, of the battles she fought in silence, and how it had drained the life from her. When we finally arrived, I could feel the tension in the air. I carefully unloaded her body and began the process of preparing her for embalming. The man stayed in the room, standing in the corner, not saying a word. He wouldn't leave her side, even for a moment. As I began setting up the embalming station, a strange feeling washed over me. The room seemed to grow colder, heavier, as if something was waiting in the silence. I shook it off, thinking it was just the late hour and the quiet surroundings. But then, I heard something. It was so faint at first that I thought it was just the wind outside, but it grew clearer. Laughter. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I froze, unsure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but it was real. The elderly man, who had been silent up until then, walked over to the table where his wife's body lay. His hands were shaking, but he leaned in close to her, whispering in a voice so soft that it seemed to vibrate in the room. "I'm here, my love." In that moment, her eyes fluttered open. I couldn't believe it. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at her. Her lips curled into a serene, faint smile. It was impossible. She had been gone for hours, but now, there she was, looking almost peaceful, like nothing had changed. The man stood there, his tears falling softly as he kissed her forehead. "Rest now, my darling," he whispered, his voice cracked. "I'll see you again soon." And just like that, her eyes closed again. The smile faded. The room grew colder, if that was even possible. The atmosphere became thick with something, grief, or perhaps something else, something unspoken. I didn't know what I had just witnessed. I couldn't explain it. Was it just a trick of the light? Was it something that happens when the body is prepared for preservation, some final act of the mind? Or was it something more? I was rattled, and I didn't sleep for days after that. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, the way she opened her eyes, the way the room had shifted. I told myself it was probably just a combination of exhaustion and the heavy emotions of the night. But deep down I knew what I had seen. Was it her way of saying goodbye? A final moment of connection between two souls who had shared so much together? I didn't know. But I do know this. Some things, some mysteries, are better left unexplored. And that night, I learned that the line between life and death is thinner than we could ever imagine. My name's Regina, and I've never forgotten the time I worked at a funeral home. It wasn't my dream job, more of a stopgap while I was in college, but it paid the bills. It was the kind of place that on the surface was full of quiet, somber routines. But after that night, I'm not sure if I ever saw the world the same way again. I remember it was late, just past 10 p.m., and I was finishing up a final viewing for the night. I had locked the doors, turned off the lights, and started preparing to close the office when I heard the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just another late visitor or someone who had stayed behind after a service. But when I turned around, I saw a man standing in the entryway. He looked out of place, dressed in a sharp black suit, The kind you might wear to a wedding or an important business meeting, but the way he stood there was off. He looked lost, disoriented even. His eyes scanned the room as if he didn't quite understand where he was. It was unsettling. "Can I help you?" I asked, walking toward him. His gaze snapped to mine, and for a moment he didn't say anything. When he did speak, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. I don't think I'm supposed to be here." I paused, not sure how to respond. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked, trying to make sense of his confusion. But he didn't answer. Instead, he looked past me, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I think I made a mistake," he murmured before turning away. And then, just like that, he walked out. I was a little confused, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People grieve in all sorts of ways, and I figured maybe he was just overwhelmed by emotion. It wasn't exactly rare for people to come in, lost in their thoughts, unable to fully process what they were going through. A couple of hours passed, and I was about to lock up when something caught my eye. I glanced over at one of the unused viewing rooms, and to my surprise, I saw the same man sitting alone in one of the chairs. The room was dark, save for a faint light from the hallway, and he was just sitting there, motionless, staring at the empty space where the casket should have been. My heart skipped a beat. This room hadn't been in use all day, and I was certain no one was supposed to be there. I walked closer to the door, trying to get his attention. "Excuse me, sir," I called softly, but he didn't respond. I tried the door, but it was locked. Something wasn't right. I stepped back, panic creeping into my chest. No one else had a key to that room, except for the director and the security guard. I quickly went to find him, and he came with me, a look of concern on his face. When we reached the door, he told me it had been locked all day, and that it was impossible for anyone to get inside. "Are you sure someone's in there?" he asked, eyeing the door skeptically. I nodded. I had just seen the man sitting there. Together we unlocked the door, and when we stepped inside, the room was empty. No man, no chair, just the quiet emptiness. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But that wasn't the end of it. As I walked past another viewing room where a service was taking place, I noticed something strange. A photograph on the table beside the casket. My legs went weak when I saw it. The man I had seen earlier, sitting alone in the locked room, was the same person in the picture. I froze. The man in the photo wasn't just a visitor. He was the deceased. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. One of my co-workers, who had noticed my reaction, looked at me with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I could barely speak, but I managed to explain what had happened. Expecting her to brush it off, I was shocked when she simply nodded and said, "You're not the first to see something like that here." She told me that many employees had experienced odd occurrences at the funeral home. Shadows in the halls, whispers in the dark, even full apparitions of the deceased. She believed that some souls got stuck, caught between worlds, not ready to move on. I didn't stay long after that night. I finished out the few remaining months, but every time I passed those empty rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. And every so often, when I was alone, I'd hear something, a faint whisper, a soft shuffling sound, and my heart would race. But nothing ever came close to that night. It's funny, isn't it? How places like that can change you. They make you question everything, and nothing feels the same afterward. I don't work there anymore, but I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget the man in the suit, who wasn't quite ready to leave. And if you ever work late in a place like that, I wouldn't be surprised if you meet someone who isn't quite ready either. My name's Rachel, and I've worked at the Ashford Funeral Home for almost 5 years. If you asked me about my job, I'd tell you it's one of those things you learn to handle, part of the routine. But some nights, like the one I'll never forget, the things we deal with go beyond what you can explain away with logic. It was a cold Tuesday evening when the body of a man came in. His name was Sam, just 29 years old, and he had passed away in a horrible car accident. They said his injuries were so severe that the doctors barely recognized him when he arrived. His body was badly bruised, and his face, well, it didn't look like him anymore. His family, heartbroken, asked us to do whatever we could to make him presentable for the viewing the next day. I was working that evening with a new intern, Chris. He was young and a little nervous, but eager to learn. That night, though, both of us were going to learn something we never expected. The building was quiet, almost too quiet. As I was setting up the embalming room, gathering tools, and getting ready to prepare Sam's body, I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. It was strange. There wasn't anyone else in the building at that hour, and I'd checked all the rooms before. "I'll go check it out," I told Chris, trying to keep my tone steady. Maybe it was just the wind or the old building creaking. I climbed up to the second floor where the bodies are temporarily stored before they're prepared. The room where Sam lay was dark, except for the dull, flickering lights from the hallway. I was alone in there, but as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the floor, tucked between the cabinet and the wall, was a small teddy bear. It was out of place. We never allowed personal items in the prep rooms unless they came from the family. I glanced around but didn't see anything that could explain how it ended up there. I picked it up and placed it on a nearby counter, then headed back downstairs to finish prepping Sam. When I started working on him, there was a strange feeling in the air. It wasn't a bad feeling, but a weight, like the room was holding its breath. As I cleaned his wounds and applied embalming fluids, I swore I heard whispers, soft, like voices just on the edge of hearing. I looked at Chris, who was focused but didn't seem to notice anything. I didn't say anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. And then, it happened. I was leaning over Sam's body, adjusting the position of his arms when I heard it clear as day. A soft, raspy voice, barely above a whisper, right in my ear. "Give it to her." My body went rigid. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room felt colder, and for a moment I was sure I had imagined it. Chris looked up, noticing my pale face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "Hear what?" I shook my head, unwilling to admit I was rattled by something I couldn't explain. I decided to push through and finish the job, but as I continued working, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Sam's head, which had been perfectly still when I started, was now slightly turned toward the small teddy bear I had left on the counter. His eyelids, which had been shut tight, were now halfway open. It was as though he was looking directly at the bear. I didn't want to scare Chris, so I just muttered, "Let's finish up." The rest of the night passed in silence. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't figure out what. The next morning, when Sam's family arrived, his wife was a mess. She was clinging to a small bag, tears streaming down her face. She explained to the funeral director that Sam had recently bought a teddy bear for their daughter Emma to give to her as a graduation gift. Emma had just finished kindergarten, and Sam had been so proud. But the bear was nowhere to be found when the hospital released Sam's personal effects. I felt my heart drop to my stomach. I excused myself, trying to hold it together, and went to retrieve the bear from the prep room. When I handed it to his wife, her face went pale. She clutched the bear to her chest, sobbing. "That's it," she whispered. "That's the one he bought for her. It's the last thing he wanted her to have." I stood there, completely stunned, not knowing what to say, but curiosity got the better of me, and I asked the security guard to check the surveillance footage from the night before. It was grainy and barely visible, but what I saw made my blood run cold. A shadow moved through the room where Sam's body had been, pausing by the counter where the teddy bear had been placed. The shadow lingered for a moment before disappearing down the hall. There was no explanation for it, no person, no logical reason for what I was seeing. But I knew deep down what it meant. That bear had been returned to its rightful place by Sam somehow, some way. His spirit had lingered, ensuring that his final gift reached the daughter he loved so much. And even though I couldn't explain it, I couldn't deny that it was a moment of connection between life and death, proof that love, in some form, transcends even the greatest of boundaries. From that night on, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the people we lose aren't as gone as we think. Sometimes they leave pieces of themselves behind in ways we don't always understand. I still remember that night, even though it feels like it happened forever ago. My name's Michael, and for several years, I worked at a small funeral home tucked away in a quiet town. It wasn't the kind of job that gets a lot of attention, but there's something about the work that gets under your skin. Most of the time, it's just routine, embalming, preparing bodies for viewings, managing paperwork. But every so often, something happens that makes you question everything you thought you knew about life and death. One rainy evening, I was the only one on shift. It had been a slow day, and I was tasked with preparing the body of an elderly man who had passed away in his sleep. He'd lived a long life and was well known in the community. Everyone spoke of him fondly, especially about his devotion to his late wife, who had passed away several years before. It was a quiet, peaceful death, a stark contrast to some of the more violent cases I dealt with over the years. I brought his body in from the cold storage, careful with each step. He looked almost peaceful lying there as if asleep. The embalming process was uneventful, no strange occurrences, no unusual feelings. The whole time I couldn't help but think about how calm he seemed. His face was relaxed, almost as if he was smiling in his sleep. Maybe it was just my imagination, but the thought of a man like him passing peacefully comforted me, especially considering the troubled lives I had seen pass through that place. Once the embalming was complete, I dressed him in a simple but elegant suit, just as the family had requested. They had also asked for a small Bible to be placed on his chest. I carefully arranged it and made sure the casket was just the way they'd want it. I set the scene in the viewing room, adjusting the lighting so it was soft but still enough to show the man's face clearly. Everything looked perfect, almost serene. With the room ready, I decided to take a short break. The funeral home was eerily quiet, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I sat in the office trying to relax, but then I heard something. It was faint at first, a creaking sound, like a door opening. I frowned. The door to the viewing room had been closed tightly when I left it. I could have sworn I locked it. I grabbed a flashlight, my heartbeat picking up pace, and walked down the narrow hallway toward the viewing room. The door was cracked open just a little, just enough to make me nervous. With a quiet breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The casket that had been closed when I left was now open, the lid slightly ajar. I froze, unsure of what to make of it. I'd been the only one here, and I hadn't heard anyone else come in. My mind raced with possible explanations. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly. But that didn't explain the sense of dread creeping over me. I walked toward the casket, the light from my flashlight flickering over the man's still form. His hands were still clasped over the Bible, just like I'd arranged them. His face looked the same, serene, peaceful. But then I saw it. His lips, those lips that had been relaxed moments before, now seemed to curl ever so slightly into a smile. I blinked, my heart hammering in my chest. No, this can't be happening. I took a step back, trying to calm myself. Maybe I'd misremembered his expression. Maybe I was tired. But the smile was undeniable. As I stood there, frozen, the lights overhead flickered, casting long, haunting shadows across the room. The smile seemed to grow larger in the dim light, as if it were mocking me. I stepped back, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the sense of dread crawling up my spine. And then it happened. His eyes that had been shut tight during the embalming, slowly opened. They didn't just open, they seemed to focus directly on me. I staggered back, barely able to breathe. His lips parted slightly as though he wanted to speak, but there was no sound. Panic took over and I bolted out of the room, locking the door behind me. I collapsed on the floor in the hallway, my heart racing and my hands trembling. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? I tried to tell myself that I was just tired, that I needed to take a step back, but something deep inside me felt wrong. The hours dragged on, and eventually another staff member arrived to take over the shift. I knew I couldn't avoid the room forever, so I gathered what little courage I had left and walked back to the viewing room with him. I expected to see something, anything, that would confirm what I had witnessed. But when I opened the door, everything was normal again. The casket was closed, his eyes were shut, and his expression was peaceful, just like before. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe I'd imagined it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened that night. Something that went beyond explanation. Even now, I still think about that smile. Was it just a trick of the light? Or was it something else? Something that shouldn't be explained. I'll never know, but the memory of those eyes staring at me, and the smile that never quite reached them, still haunts me. I wish I could say I've made peace with it, but I haven't, and I don't think I ever will. I've been working as a morgue assistant for a few years now, and I still remember that one night like it happened yesterday. It's not something I talk about much. Who would believe me? Even now it feels like some twisted dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and it still haunts me. The morgue isn't a glamorous place, and it's not a place for the faint-hearted. You'd be surprised how many people think we just deal with quiet, peaceful souls. But the truth is, most bodies that come through those doors come from tragic, horrifying situations, accidents, crimes, suicides. Some of them even come with a backstory that makes you question the kind of life they led. Some were good people and some weren't. But I'll tell you this, I never thought much about the dead, not until that night. It was a Saturday, late in the fall. A terrible accident had happened on the freeway. Multiple cars, a pile-up, so many bodies. I was the newest assistant on the floor, so I was sent up to the upper rooms to handle some of the less urgent cases, away from the chaos below. It didn't seem like much of a task, just checking over a few bodies that had already been processed, making sure their records were up to date. But the quiet of that place gets to you. There's a stillness that wraps around you, and it's suffocating, almost like the silence is waiting for something to break it. I wasn't even halfway through my shift when I decided to grab a snack in the break room. The place was practically deserted except for my 2 co-workers downstairs in the reception area. I grabbed a sandwich and poured myself some coffee, sitting down to take a moment. That's when I remembered I had a question for one of my colleagues about a specific case in the basement. I figured it wouldn't take long, so I made my way down to the lower level. As I descended the stairs, I heard my name. It was clear as day, echoing off the stone walls. Liam. Liam. 3 times, faint but distinct. My stomach twisted. I thought it was a bit odd, but I shrugged it off, assuming one of my colleagues was calling me for something trivial. I was sure it was just them messing around, trying to get my attention, but when I stepped into the basement, the place was silent. Dead silent. The dim lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the room. 6 bodies were covered with white sheets, lying on their metal gurneys. No one else was around. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. I was sure I'd heard someone call my name, but there wasn't a soul in sight. I thought maybe I was just hearing things, exhaustion messing with my mind. But then I heard it. Laughter, faint but unmistakable. It came from the reception area, and it sounded like one of my co-workers was pulling a prank. It was something they did all the time, especially to rookies like me. I wasn't going to let them get the better of me, though, so I decided to climb halfway up the stairs and catch them in the act. I checked every corner, every storage closet, but there was no one. It was just me and the walls. I felt a chill run through me, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I decided to finish what I came down to do, but then it happened again. I heard the laughter, louder this time, and coming from one of the bodies. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, frozen for a moment, and stared at the sheet covering the corpse. There was a slight movement, like something was shifting under the fabric. My mind raced. Maybe it was a rat or some other animal, something harmless, but something told me that wasn't the case. My legs felt heavy as I slowly walked toward the body. I pulled back the sheet, expecting to see nothing more than the remains of a mangled corpse from the crash. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a body. This thing was different. Its mouth twitched, almost like it was trying to smile, its grotesque face contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. One eye, one single lifeless eye, was wide open, and it locked onto mine. staring directly at me with an intensity that I couldn't explain. I don't know how long I stood there. My body was frozen, my mind was racing, but my feet wouldn't move. That eye, it was like it was watching me, almost like it was aware of me. And then, as if to confirm my worst fear, it slowly shifted, turning its gaze toward me with unnatural precision. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Without thinking, I turned and ran up the stairs as fast as I could. I didn't even care about my coffee or the sandwich I had left behind. All I could hear was the pounding of my own footsteps and the echo of that eerie laughter still ringing in my ears. When I reached the top, my colleagues were there, chatting like everything was normal. They stopped talking when they saw my face, pale and drenched in sweat. I could hardly speak, but I stammered out the story of what had just happened. I expected them to be as terrified as I was, but instead they laughed. They thought I was trying to pull a prank on them. They told me I was imagining things, that it was just my nerves getting the best of me. I tried to convince them, but they didn't believe me. They said I should take a break, maybe grab some fresh air. When we went back to the basement together, everything was just as it had been before. The bodies were still there, covered with the same white sheets. The room was quiet again. Nothing had changed. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Was it my mind playing tricks on me? Was I exhausted and hallucinating? Or was it something else entirely? Whatever it was, I can't forget that eye, the way it stared at me with such cold, empty intensity. I've been working in that morgue ever since, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that something is still down there, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can hear that faint, eerie laughter echoing through the halls again.